Okay, hi everybody. Welcome back after the coffee break. We continue here in the panel forum. And in our next activity, we will be discussing overcoming the gap for an inclusive education, making an impact through best practices. With us, we have our speakers, Ellen Desmarais. She's Executive Vice President at Education Hub Business Publishing. Also, Anne Michaud, Associate Dean for Education Track and Pedagogy from HEC France. And this panel will be moderated by Maria Eugenia Marin, Vice Provost for Academic Alliance from IE University. Please, thank you very much. Welcome.
It's afternoon, right? Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our panel. You probably saw in the program that we had 3 speakers. Our colleague from Germany unfortunately tested positive for COVID and will not be able to join us. But I'm sure that we have enough conversation to go around to do the panel. So. As I was introduced, my name is Maria Eugenia Marin. I'm Vice Provost for Academic Partnerships and Alliances at IE. I think the best thing will be for my panelists to introduce themselves and maybe, so that you are better informed as to how they're actually working on this topic from their own institutions. And then we'll go on to bring up some points, share some benchmarking, some experiences, and building from that. So why don't we start? Ellen, you want to start? Yeah?
So Ellen Desmarais, I am Executive Vice President for the Education Division at Harvard Business Publishing. And what Harvard Business Publishing is a separate commercial entity that is affiliated with Harvard University. And what we were set up for about 30 years ago was in some ways about inclusion. How do you take the quality education that is developed at Harvard Business School and allow it to be accessible by more students and educators around the world? So that's a lot of our focus, is particularly kind of on reaching the educators. My background is a mix in education, media, and learning. I've spent time at McGraw-Hill, but I've also spent time at the Wall Street Journal. So I'm also particularly interested in the point of how our media organizations today are also blending into the learning world.
Okay, thank you. Anne, yeah?
Yes, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm Anne Michaud, Associate Dean for Pedagogy and Education at HEC. So the reason why this topic is important is that, of course, it's about training, raising awareness for professors in the school, and also thinking about how can we include these topics in the curriculum of our students, but not only in the curriculum, also really in their life at school. And in background, I'm a marketing professor originally. I've been many years at HEC. My topic of expertise is more around the luxury business, and that's a business that has looked at this topic very intensely as well. And altogether, so I think my interest is in that, in my job today at HEC, but also from the past working with them.
Thank you very much. What we'd like to do is we'll leave maybe 10 minutes for questions and answers at the end. And I'm going to basically just try to set a framework, general framework, and maybe just direct some questions to our speakers. So they can elaborate. No, I think the objective here is to kind of think a little bit out of the box. We come from different types of education institutions, so obviously maybe our diversity and inclusion strategies are tailored more to what we do. There's quite a difference between working for Harvard Publishing or working at a higher education institution. So I think as you probably all know, the subject of diversity and inclusion has become very prominent, in recent years. I think it's also important to emphasize that really means very different things depending on where you're sitting. I think if you talk about diversity and inclusion, probably in the US, you're probably looking at other factors, no, than you are probably at a higher education institution in France. So I think we're fortunate to have speakers that can kind of represent, a wider scope on the subject. So thank you for that. I think, as you probably know, we've seen diversity and inclusion offices be set up just about everywhere, in not only in higher education institutions, but in companies, in other types of organizations. Now, I think some of the major drivers have been, at least I think in the US, and I think had it impacted globally, was the whole, I guess, the racial issue, probably that stemmed from the killing of Floyd, and I think that set off, kind of a major discussion on diversity and inclusion with respect to race. But obviously, there's also a lot of gender-related discrimination that has also popped up, in different spaces. I think COVID has also, on the one hand, raised awareness, or has allowed us to kind of leverage the benefits of moving in a digital space, but at the same time, I think it's raised awareness of some of the inequality that exists, with respect to, I guess I would term it digital equity. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So from where I sit, and then maybe we can go on to the questions, I manage our IE's academic partnerships and alliances, and obviously diversity and inclusion would be more related to offering cross-border opportunities for our students, because whether we like it or not, traveling abroad to study for a semester, for a year, whatever, obviously requires funding, and not everyone has access to that. So on my end, I'm trying to think creatively about how we can actually offer international experiences, be more inclusive with respect to the international opportunities we offer our students, and maybe how we work with our partner institutions. So that's kind of the space that I come from. But let's define this as leveling, I would say, diversity and inclusion strategies kind of level the playing field, irrespective of what type of institution we work for. So let's see about, well, let me just go straight to maybe the questions, because if I go in and discuss all the points, then maybe we won't, we will have covered everything. But let's also think more broadly. It's not only about students and faculty, it's about the student experience, it's about cultural diversity or diversity in all its forms. It's about raising awareness, on what that is, eliminating biases and stereotypes, all that, and that can be done in and outside of the classroom. It's also about how do we open access or broaden access to our stakeholders or our students, via scholarships, et cetera. So to make higher education more inclusive, et cetera. And then many other things, pedagogy, all sorts of things. So I think I'll just start with, because I'd like to hear from both of you on what you're doing and how you're addressing some of the issues. So why don't you tell me maybe the focus areas with respect to diversity inclusion over the last years, or, from at your own institutions. Maybe we could talk about 3 major, strategic initiatives, based, and really, if you could tell us if you've been able to kind of measure their effectiveness or the outcome, or maybe it's still in process. But it would be, why don't we start with you, Ellen?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so for Harvard Business Publishing, we are not an educational institution ourselves, but we work with educational institutions, and we work at this point in time with over 4,000 around the globe. So to your point, we are seeing that how institutions are thinking about diversity and inclusion is in itself incredibly diverse, right? For some colleges, it has really been about kind of just the diversity of the student body. You can talk to other campuses, and particularly when we talk about the I component, it is incredibly broad. And in fact, the inclusion efforts have brought together, I think, in a very positive way, a lot of aspects of programs management that typically have been very disparate. So when we think about it as HBP, we really kind of focus on two aspects then of inclusion. We think first it's about access. And what is the role that we have a unique opportunity to play in increasing the number of students who have access to a quality education? You know, as HBP was set up 30 years ago to try and bring the best practices of business and management and leadership to the world, it's very important to us that the best practices in business, management, and leadership are not the privilege of the elite. Right? So what does that mean to try and expand the access? So one of the things that for us has just been really increasing our global footprint. Who do we work with? And continuing to kind of get beyond the borders. So at this point in time, we work with schools on 6 continents. I don't think we figured out a way to crack Antarctica yet. If anybody has a contact there, please let us know. And I think at this moment in time, the other thing that we're finding really interesting is going beyond our traditional customer and partner set to really think about more what is happening in the ed tech arena, what are happening with startups. We're even seeing corporates trying to kind of play a different role in this. And an example of that is we very recently actually started working here with Santander. And we are partnered with them for their scholarship program. And we recently launched a Business for All scholarship using some of our content and working with them to create a really meaningful course certificate that's allowing 5,000 students for 13 geographies to have a shot at learning business fundamentals from Harvard content. So I think that's a great example of kind of breaking the paradigm of who we work with as we try to expand access for education. And then another area we focus on a lot that I'm sure Anne is actually going to have a lot to say about as well is what actually happens inside the classroom from an inclusion perspective. You know, because we work with 4,000 business programs, educators are really our frontline customer at HBP. It is the educator who's making decisions about what to use in their classroom from our materials and then how to run their classrooms. So we've just been trying to do a lot to gather the best practices, to learn from the amazing educators out there that are on the forefront of thinking about this and advancing the lines. And I think one of the things we've really come to appreciate about the best practices, it's just as much about what happens before you get into your classroom as well as then what happens when you're in the classroom. We're having fascinating conversations with professors, and I think particularly coming from the US market, we're hearing the phrase, decolonize your curriculum. And that is really important and a really impactful way that educators can start to think about how am I addressing inclusion in my classroom can be at a very basic level of who are the business leaders I am actually choosing to focus on this classroom, and what does my student body actually look like, and am I bringing forward examples of leaders that they would connect with? It's even sometimes down to the way you write your syllabus. You know, we hear so much about, particularly in the US, there's all this legalese that is now ending up in these, you know, in your syllabi. It's not just about what to read and prepare, but it's all these rules and everything you're supposed to do. And they've become almost legal documents. And I think it's really interesting to hear of educators independently trying to say, how do I use that syllabus as an invitation to my class? I think one of the frameworks we talk a lot about at HBP when it comes to inclusion actually comes from Frances Frye at Harvard Business School, who has written about this concept of the inclusion dial. And she talks about it on 4 dimensions. And it's kind of like Maslow's hierarchy. You can't move up if you haven't addressed the basics. And the first one for inclusion is safe. Does a student feel safe in this classroom, right? Are their emotional and physical needs looked after? You need to feel safe before you get to the next step of, I feel welcome. I feel like somebody wants me to be in this room. And you can't get to the third step of actually feeling celebrated, which is somebody wants me in this room. They value what I'm bringing to this equation. And then the fourth is cherished, like this room is better because I am in it. So I think these aspects of where educators are probably dealing with is still in the safe category, and that's a role too for all members of staff and faculty to play. But I think the educators have a particularly interesting opportunity to think about the welcome.
No, I like that. Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's very, very interesting. And I think content in general, no, needs to be, I would say, more diverse and more inclusive, you know, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, students need to feel that they are represented, you know, and I think I think we have, as higher ed institutions, often failed in that sense. You know, we have very standard, and this whole rethinking of curriculum, I think, is key. I also maybe like to mention, you know, it's also about raising awareness, no, in the classroom. You're talking about students wanting to feel welcome. And before feeling welcome, they have to feel like they have something to contribute, no? And I think when we talk about cultural diversity, for example, I think we need to understand cultural sensitivities and adapt, raise awareness not only you know, in the classroom, but also amongst our faculty, no? I think often we don't manage to engage students the way we should because we're really not being aware, we don't have the level of awareness, you know, that is needed to have them feel engaged, and they might feel excluded, no? So I think there's a lot of work to be done in that space, in the education space in general. So, but anyway, Anne, I will let you also continue on that point. I'm sure you're doing lots of interesting things at HSA in that respect as well.
Sure. Couldn't agree more with the raising awareness part.
Yes, raising awareness.
I think we're in a business where we have a huge opportunity, and also it's a challenge. It's the human interaction business in which we are. Education is about interacting with humans, and I think a lot of our schools, some were already very international for many years, but if I look at what happened in my own school, we have reached this diversity very fast in the last 2 decades. So if I look at 2 decades ago, I was teaching in French at HEC. Today, I don't teach a single class in French for the last 10 years. And that's just a reality. But at the same time, I didn't change my faculty just like this. Mm-hmm. So in fact, people have to adapt to this huge change that there has been. And we need to accompany them in that change, because we cannot just take it for granted that they are going to find the solutions alone when they have to take care about their own topics as well, and so on. So it's more about, yes, indeed, how do we make sure that we accompany them, that we break stereotypes. So just to mention, you know, one of many, I don't know if you ever try to Google the word professor, but look at the pictures that you get, and if you Google icon professor, it's even worse. But so altogether, we have to raise the awareness of all those stereotypes that we have. And it's not only about the professors, because we reached diversity in our audiences, but not always in our faculty, not always in our leadership, and by the way, not always in all the staff that there is around us in universities, because diversity also, I mean, what we communicate goes in every single person that we have around, and every single things that we do around it. So it's quite important that we think about the global picture of this.
Yes.
And then, of course, it's about the content a lot. And for this, it's about bringing, I think, faculty to question what is it that we teach, how do we teach it, and what do we use to teach it. So indeed, content, cases that we use, people that we invite to be witnesses to give testimonials in our courses. All of that is super important. And of course, when we ask people to change, usually it's a little bit of a process.
No.
So for me, one of the big challenges on the topic is really that one.
Yeah. And what are you training faculty? I mean, I can say that at IE, and I want to add staff, you know. I mean, when you think about all the stakeholders, you know, that are involved in creating this experience, you know, for our students or the schools that we work with. I mean, they work with staff, they work with admissions, they work with our recruitment office. So we need to address the entire experience, no? Matriculation to probably once they leave the institution. So we have probably the same issue as I just said with respect to the diversity. You know, we have 140 nationalities on our campus. We do diversity training for staff, and we do it also for students, obviously. And I would assume, I'm not too familiar with this area, that we also do it for faculty. But how are you tackling the faculty issue? Because it's not always easy, You could get students to hear about, raise the awareness of students, and teach them how to leverage that diversity in the classroom and throughout the learning experience. But how do you do that with faculty who are set in their ways, and not willing to, decolonize their curriculum or modify their curriculum or be sensitive to their audience? How do you tackle that? Do you do anything specifically? Maybe you do things as well or have worked with schools on that issue. What do you do specifically for that? Because I think that's a tough area. It's a challenging area.
It's very tough, and I think even before we think about training professors or raising awareness, the number one thing that we had to do is to identify, craft, probably define what was inclusion for us.
Okay.
So what does it mean today when you're in Europe, and also with all the models that we have across the globe, to decide in one school, where do we stand? What is it that we want to envision as being the inclusion seen by our school? It doesn't need to be exactly the same as seen in other contexts. So we've put together inclusion committee, diversity and inclusion committee, and that was their first task, to decide what is it. What do you define as being the inclusion at HEC Paris? And then the next thing is write a charter about it. That would be for every single student to sign when they arrive. That would be for every single person in the staff to know about, every single professor to know about. And this is what we expect in terms of, living together, learning together, obviously. But how do we want to do that? And in fact, that only thing that you have a charter that people have to sign to be aware of, that's already a huge step into awareness, because that means that, wow, this is a topic that we took seriously, and we have a D&I associate dean and so on. So
I like that.
That became a topic that is not sort of at a second level.
Yeah. I like that. Your engagement with faculty, what has your experience been with respect to that?
Yeah, we've definitely seen the shift in terms of, our traditional professional development training offering that we did for educators was how to teach with cases and how to teach with simulations. And then last year we launched how to address the self and identity in your classroom. So that headline in some ways says it all, that there's a deep need, right, I think at this moment in time, we are still at the awareness phase in a lot of ways. And I think we have to collectively be unrelenting in keeping up the awareness levels. And I think the schools that I see tackling it in interesting ways is maybe a different way to talk about it, is NYU's MBA program, for example, put as part of their orientation program, actually had all of the students fill out a cross-cultural competency survey that they'd also had all the staff do and all the faculty do. So there was something, number one, about creating that shared experience that everybody at the university was doing it, I think became a great leveler. And I think one of the things they did an excellent job of impressing on the students is increasing your cultural competence, which was a lot of how they framed kind of a consideration for inclusion, is a journey. Nobody, and let me tell you, I've now taken the assessment. Nobody takes this assessment and gets an A on it right away. It very much is a message, no matter how good you may even think you are at this, you have a long path to go. So I think finding sort of unique ways that connect with the culture of your campus is really important. I think the other thing we've heard a lot of, honestly, that's almost more troubling, is from educators who say, this is important to me, and I understand that I have a role to play in enhancing diversity and ensuring inclusion in my classroom, but my school is not setting up charters. My school is not, putting committees together. I don't know where to turn. So a lot of what we've been sort of trying to put out more information on is that point of what can you do in your own classroom. And I think, connecting a little bit back even to the idea of your syllabus, one of the most helpful things we've heard educators talk about is opening their first class with the rules of engagement for their classroom. And I think that's really valuable because as we see this increasing, I mean, the sheer numbers you're talking about with IE, right, of the geographies represented in your classroom, there's this increasing desire to have global classrooms, and we want to be building global leaders. So this importance of cross-cultural communication. And I think there's great ways to just model that behavior in a classroom with a professor taking a moment to explain, you may have sat in classrooms for the past 20 years, but here's how my classroom is going to work. And I use that example because for those who have participated in a case method classroom, you know, it is very high in student participation. There can be a very Socratic method. There's an expectation of a back and forth. A student that comes from Japan has never seen that. And they often are really struck their first week at Harvard Business School of like, I don't understand. I think these fellow students are being rude to the professor. What's going on here? So realizing that part of leveling the playing field is also part of having conversations about how we actually interact with each other. And I think for us, it's been a lot that awareness that first it's becoming aware, and then secondly, can we actually try to talk about this? It's one of the hardest things to do, but it can be one of actually the most meaningful things to do because you're also now teaching those students a skill themselves that when they leave the classroom, and they hopefully are working, you know, in multicultural teams and cross-cultural context, you've taught them, and when they're going to lead a team in an amazing, you know, global company someday, how did they have that conversation with their own team?
No, absolutely. I'd just like to highlight 2 points. I actually do teach cross-cultural management, and in a classroom of 50, you could have 30 nationalities, and I think they do an assessment before coming into the classroom. And then they have to do one when they leave and they finalize their program to see if there's been a shift, you know, because the course is actually to help raise the level of awareness. But I think an important thing that I think should be part of any sort of strategy in that sense is that it is, you know, to present it or to include how to leverage that diversity. You know, what does diversity offer in the classroom, in your own personal development, you know, in the outside world? You know, diversity breeds creativity and innovation. No, it's much nicer to have a very diverse team, you know, that you're working on. The creativity, you know, is tremendous versus a very homogeneous team. No, so, you know, help them understand that diversity is, you know, it's something to leverage, and it's something that's just going to broaden their scope of thinking, you know? So I think that's important. And another point that you mentioned that I think is important as well is that we have to walk the talk, right? We have to walk the talk. We talk about, and I'm not just talking about in higher education institutions, but I think also we see it in companies. We talk about our diversity and inclusion policies, and yet our leadership maybe, you know, or is not representative, or other actions we're involved, not representative of what we're actually promoting. So I think that is very, very important, you know, because if you want students to buy into that, you have to walk the talk, you know, and we're talking about inclusion, diversity inclusion at all levels, right? So I think that's important to also always keep in mind in a strategy, no? And that comes from leadership, as we said, you know, it kind of has to come from the top down, right? So, no, great. That was really, really interesting. Let me throw some other questions at you. You know, there's been a lot of talk, and I, you know, reflect a lot on digital equity, you know, and mostly as a result of COVID, no? Like I said, in my particular area, you know, face-to-face, global opportunities for students is really, in a way, very much for the privileged, you know, few. And it's what it has done is made me reflect on how many parts in, you know, regions in the world don't have, you know, they're struggling with. Let's talk about COVID, moving over from, you know, from face to face to online. You know, I know some schools in Africa that were actually struggling with hardware issues, no, with internet access. Students didn't have physical space in their homes to follow the classes. So before they can even think about moving to the online space, they've got to resolve these problems, right? So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I think COVID in that sense has been an eye-opener, no? And with respect to inclusion, you know, and digital equity and all that. And I don't know what your thoughts. I would love your thoughts on that, and what, you know, if you have been involved in any initiatives related to that, or how you see that. No, you wanna start, Anne? Yeah.
I can. In fact, it's a very important question. I think when we did this switch online, I didn't realize how much we had to deal with these inequalities in our student body. People who didn't have, I'm talking about networks, access to networks. I'm talking about hardware, but we don't need to go to, remote countries.
Exactly.
We have in my school, and I think in many schools, we try to have more diverse student body. So we have increased scholarships. But sometimes students that have a scholarship doesn't mean that they have the means to buy a computer the first month that they arrive at university. Mm-hmm. The truth is today, let's look at our curriculum. Mm-hmm. A lot of the content, it's available online. Well, availability online is great if you have a computer. Yeah. But if you don't, that makes things slightly more complicated, especially if you have to watch videos, take quizzes, and so on. Mm-hmm. And we did all that to enrich their curriculum, to facilitate their learning, and so on. But in fact, we have to really make sure that by doing so, we don't increase inequalities between students. Mm-hmm. So what we have to do today is make sure that we have sort of computers that we can lend them if they don't have one, or if they break one, or if anything. Yeah. So it's very practical. How do you make sure that your students have access all the time? And then there's another thing that was we focused very much on training professors to master these ed-tech tools that we have all over the place, in fact, what's very important is to also train students. So to do the mirror training, because we all assume that they are geeks because they are digital natives. But sometimes they are not that geeks. Mm-hmm. And if it's part of their learning, then we need to make sure that we enable them to make the most of it. Mm-hmm. And for that, they also have to be trained to make the most of it.
Yeah, no, very interesting. And I like that point about how it's not just, in less developed parts of the world, but it also happens in our classrooms, no? So please, Ellen, if you want to share.
I think Anne's personal experience there definitely resonates with what we've heard and experienced, that, in some ways, COVID exposed diversity that we weren't aware of when we were in a campus environment, right? These students were on campus in dorm rooms, and then when they went home, and particularly when there was that whole debate of the cameras on versus cameras off in the online classroom, I think it was one of the things that was a big aha, that one of the reasons a lot of students didn't want their cameras on was not about their participation. It was about the space they were sitting in.
Yeah.
And I think that's like such an fascinating and complicated and messy part of what COVID brought to us in this awareness part of diversity and inclusion, and maybe hopefully in a good way for all of us who are in a position to do something about it. But there is that whole aspect of the diversity we do not see. Sometimes mean it is diversity we do not appreciate or think about. So as we think about awareness around diversity, it's, I think, helped to increase our sensitivity to socioeconomic diversity. In some markets, we do a lot of business in India. Religion is an enormous diversity factor, right? We're increasingly hearing more about the connectivity between disability and inclusion, and interested to hear the schools that are actually bringing that together. And one of the most recent ones we've been starting to do more on is neurodiversity. And even starting to think about, when we look at the items we have available, right, for adoption in our catalog, do we know how many of our protagonists would associate with being neurodiverse? So I think one One of the things I think that was helpful, probably for us, goes back a little bit to Anne's point about being sensitive in what you're choosing to use in your curriculum. Actually, the fact we do so much business in India helped us because as a distributor of content, we were already dealing with the low bandwidth environments. So we sometimes have our customers, let's say in the richer part of the world, who is like, we want more multimedia cases and we want more video and could it like have music and sing and dance? And in India, they're like, I need to be able to read it on a mobile with this much bandwidth. And so it turned out our basic format that we provide content in is a PDF.
Okay.
And at the end of the day, that is the most accessible digital format. So I think it is becoming also an interesting aspect of awareness that may also be for some schools a connectivity to your accessibility efforts. But like, what are you doing to actually make your materials accessible with the least amount of bandwidth possible?
No, I like that. And I think, as you said, I have the same views on COVID, on the impact of COVID, on this discussion. But I think it has, in general, also raised awareness that we need to be ourselves a little bit more sensitive and more conscious about and increase our responsibility to sharing information, to offering opportunities, learning opportunities to other parts of the world. And I think sometimes when you're just on your own path and journey, you don't even think about it, right? And I think it has made us think outside of the box about how we can. I think we have a responsibility, to provide education, content, in whatever form, to parts of the world that don't have the same opportunities. I think that's really important. That's been a big eye-opener for me with respect to how we work with our partners. And I think, I hope to see in the future that more institutions will incorporate, that sort of, those types of activities, into their strategies. So thank you for that. This, I think, comes from a conversation I might have had with both of you. That is, when we talk about diversity and inclusion, and I think we've covered just, in terms of scholarships, we can also talk about recruitment, how we recruit, career opportunities, employability, all the things that we might be doing to kind of level out the playing field. But I think there's been a shift in recent years in higher education institutions towards a more personalized learning experience, versus something a little more standard, And I think that is also something, maybe Anna was with you and we had this conversation, that it's also a way of really attending to diversity, and inclusion in a way, because we are kind of tailoring a little bit, that to our diverse population. So I don't know if any of you maybe want to comment. Anne, I mean, I know you said you were doing something on that, or it was something you were thinking about, or how are you doing? I know we're doing a lot of that at IE, more of a personalized journey. But go ahead, please.
Okay. So I know you're doing a lot about opening content as well. So I'll try to keep some time for. In fact, the point is, once again, we go back to when we talk about personalization, we need to go back to the tech issue. So I will not go into details on that one, but I think altogether, we've been a very sort of one-size-fits-all business for a long, long time. Like we would put a diverse crowd into a classroom and give them the same message in hopes that starting from a very different learning style and knowledge at start, we would end up with people having the same knowledge at exit. And so it doesn't really work that way, and we all know about it. So I think now we'll go more into trying to personalize a little bit more the learning journeys. But honestly, I think we're still at the very infancy of doing that.
Okay.
And we are at the infancy of doing it for many reasons. One is that we'll need to learn to teach, convey knowledge in a different way. And that will probably take maybe a generation of professors and maybe more, I don't know. But I think also because for everything we said about access to this tech and so on, that will take time. And I think I'm working hard to try to get professors to be more innovative on that side.
Yeah.
Let's say it that way.
Okay, wonderful. Yes, please,
Yeah, no,
Ellen.
I mean,
know you're doing
that's
things on that, yeah.
I know, but I think I'm with Anne. Like, we collectively are in the baby steps
Steps on
stage
that,
of what
okay.
this could ultimately look like. You know, I mean, there's always the discussion about different learning styles and how can we create more flexibility to meet students kind of where they are. So to the point of, I think we feel like we're still with the basics, but one of the interesting points we've been discussing a lot with professors is, what can you be doing to level the playing field in your classroom as your class starts? And I say that, you know, and particularly for us around the case method, right? Which I was using the example, the students who have never seen it kind of are a little terrified their first week. And so we've actually developed a product to help that because we understand a case method is something that actually needs to be demystified.
Yeah, absolutely.
Once you're in, you understand it. If you've never seen it, you're like, what is going on? They gave me this long thing to read. I don't know what to do. So we developed an interactive product. It takes 1 hour for a student to go through. We tried to present it like it might be a little fun. We're waiting for the student judgment to come back on that one. We'll see what NPSs we actually get. But the idea was trying to create something how do you create a moment very early in the curriculum that allows a little bit of the gap filling? You know, in some ways, MBA programs have done this for years with the pre-matriculation programs, right? Hey, if you haven't taken statistics, or make you take the boot camp in statistics or economics or things like that. So I think trying to identify more ways to kind of demystify the content and, like I said, even demystify the approach of how you're going to teach the class can kind of start to create some, maybe those moments very early on. But I'm with Anne. We have a long way to go.
But it's interesting to hear. Well, I mean, we've talked about cultural diversity. We've talked about, you know, examples of other types of diversity. But this is a very old topic. But, you know, maybe just some thoughts on just, you know, gender, leveling the playing field for, you know, with respect to gender. No, are there any thoughts on that? You know, are there new things that you think, you know, that you are working on, or what are you doing as an institution to kind of level the playing field with respect to gender? You know.
I mean, I think we work predominantly with business schools, and so what we see making a difference is it has to be kind of a commitment throughout the entire system.
Okay.
So I think Wharton Business School, their MBA program, class of 2023, was the first to be 50-50. 50% male and 50% female, and everybody like held their breath as they enrolled the second year. And they achieved it. And when you talk to them at Howe, I mean, it was seen as a full commitment that wasn't just the admissions department's job, right? It went kind of all the way through, like, what is it going to mean for these students to feel like they have an equitable experience when they get there? What is it going to mean for some of the social and interpersonal reactions? You know, and then does that actually continue all the way through the career development process?
And how does that translate into real activities? You know, I mean, you know, you can do targeted recruitment. You can do. I mean, there's all sorts of things to promote your program to let's say women in this particular case. But once you have them there, you know, how do you keep that commitment alive? You know, because we're probably very good at selling it, and then reality hits. No, so I don't know. I don't have the answer, you know, and I'm sure, you know, I mean, obviously there's, you know, there could be scholarship schemes, there could be communities, you know, or leadership, you know, activities related to, I don't know, but I mean, I think we need to start, I don't know what you think about this, but I think we need to think out of the box, you know, and I don't know what that answer is, you know. I think we're all very familiar with the very, you know, traditional, you know, approach with the traditional approach, but I think we need to start thinking out of the box. No, I think walking the talk, you know, is part of that. You know, I mean, I want to be at an institution that reflects that diversity that, you know, is being promoted, especially I think in gender, with respect to gender equality, and you know, includes faculty, It includes, I think we've talked about, faculty, leadership, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know. I think it's just a thought, reflection that I think we need to be a little bit more, think more out of the box with respect to finding ways of doing that, no? And sometimes I think it's also, oh, sorry, I think are we running out of time? Do we have time for questions? How much time do we have? 2 minutes. Okay, well, thank you very much. I guess we have time for a couple of questions or comments. Anybody? We have one? Oh. Yes? Mm-hmm.
It's really very short question.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask you to repeat something. You said, I thought one of the things you said about feeling safe, welcome, and then it was cherished?
Celebrated and then cherished, and to give it proper
Order, yeah.
Right.
So that's that order, and it's Frances Fry, who wrote the book Unleashed.
All right.
Unleashed, Harvard Business School.
Okay, I love that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I love that. I'm going to read that
Yes,
one too. I'm
it
gonna
really
read that
is.
one too.
It's a very approachable read, too, on the topic of inclusion. We've actually asked a lot of our employees at HBP to read it and have had some discussion groups around it, which is just another way to consider kind of with faculty broaching the topic.
I love that. I love that. Okay.
So thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Any other question? And maybe we have time for one more? Yes? Sí, claro. I can translate. I'd be happy to translate.
A mí me ha gustado mucho vuestras intervenciones. He llegado un poquito tarde, pero vamos en la línea de favorecer una verdadera inclusión en la que todas las personas formen parte y obtengan logros, ¿no? Y sí que me parece que en la definición que decía Anne, ¿no?, que proponía a sus estudiantes que definieran qué era para ellos, para ellas la inclusión, creo que no debemos olvidar que la inclusión no es un principio, no es algo que surge, sino que es un derecho humano básico y principal. Entonces, partiendo de ese derecho humano, yo lo uno al ámbito que también ha comentado de los estudios de caso, del caso, ¿no? Ese caso elaborado en la que aparezcan todos y todas y las personas se sientan que forman parte y que obtienen logro. Me gusta mucho el movimiento de vida independiente, Independent Living, cuando decía nada para nosotros, para nosotras, sin nosotros y nosotras. Es decir, que en muchos ámbitos a veces pensamos que estamos como en una posición de formación del profesorado, de formación a los alumnos, y sé que estamos en la misma línea, ¿no? Pero que en esa participación es muy importante que tengas voz para participar, pero que también se te escuche de manera activa.
Okay.
Era solamente una reflexión como...
Yeah, maybe I'll just sum it up, because I think that's an interesting point. I mean, she says, obviously, inclusion is a human right, is a human right. And I think it's not only about having a voice, but dijiste, perdona, lo de ser escuchado y la segunda parte era, te escucho, si te oigo, si...
Sí,
era
por una parte ser escuchado,
yeah,
pero otra
to be
vez
heard.
También generar esos entornos en los que puedas sentirte realmente escuchado,
Okay,
que la escucha sea realmente
to be heard,
activa.
but also create environments, to have environments, where you are heard, no? And I think that's true. And I like the concept of it being a human right, and it has to be, we should all have.
Absolutely.
That
is an
So,
excellent note to end on.
Yes, thank you very
for
much.
that.
Thank
Thank
you.
you
Muchas
all.
gracias. No, gracias.
I have to.
You gotta go? Okay. Oops. I think she has another meeting. Thank you. Thank you very much.